Hi, friends. It's Sarah, the fact culture critic. So, this isn't scripted. I'm going to try and make some sense of it. I want to sort of put down some of my chaotic, frustrated thoughts about this most recent episode of Strange New Worlds. Four and a half Vulcans. Um, I hated the little excerpt that they released a couple years ago at Comic-Con. And I kind of dreaded what this episode was going to be since then, especially as I really didn't like Charades, the episode that this is sort of a sequel to. Not just because I don't like cringe comedy, but because Strange New Worlds has been doing some really weird stuff around the sort of ideas of mixed race. And so I'm going to kind of rant as a mixed race person, but also before I get into that, I also want to have a bit of discussion from the fat perspective as well, because there's also something that was clearly intended to be played as a joke about fatness in this episode, and it also just anyway. So episode 4.5 Vulcans. If you want a good breakdown, I recommend Jessie Gender. She's a friend of mine. I really loved her video about this. I always love her videos. And she talked a lot about the sort of eugenicsiness of it all. And consider this a kind of yes and a bit. In the episode Charade from last season, Spock was on a mission and encountered a alien race who attempted to fix him and made him fully human. And then we had all these things about how Spock had to learn to be Vulcan, and his personality changed because his Vulcanness was removed. And so in this one, and then Chapel had to go make a romantic speech for, God, I hate that. Chapel went and got a serum that could fix and make him back to being himself. So in this episode, for plot contriving reasons, they need to actually be Vulcan to fool a certain scanner thingy doohickey contrivance yada yada. So Pike, La'an, Uhura, and Chapel all get turned into quote unquote real Vulcans. And they are immediately also culturally Vulcan because for some reason culture translates into genetics in this story, which is fucking weird. Then the serum doesn't work to return them, and also they decide they don't want to be returned, and various hijinks ensue. And as part of the way to return them back, Una calls in her ex-boyfriend, who is a Katra expert, and a Vulcan named Doug, who is fascinated by humanity. And he off-screen teaches Spock how to connect with Katras, and then he fixes most of the crew, and then has a on-screen confrontation with La'an that is largely framed through dancing, because the show is clearly trying to take advantage of the fact that these two dance great together, these two actors, and they're really hot when they're doing it. They have great chemistry when they're dancing. Their characters, not really, but the dancing. I'd rather just have some videos of them dancing. And so La'an has a different response to the serum, which turns her more Romulan than Vulcan. And this Spock says is because of her augment-ness, is somehow predisposed to, for lack of just basically evil, aggression and suspicion and other things which are not genetic. That is sort of the brief sketch. So I have issues. So many issues. There are so many problems with this, including storytelling issues. But I'm working on a actual scripted video about the problems of the storytelling in this season of Strange New Worlds. But in the meantime, this is an unscripted rant because there are two parts to this rant. There are essentially two rants. One as a fat person. Part of one of the jokes of this running through this episode is that Una's ex-boyfriend, who she talks about having this incredible chemistry with and is irresistibly attracted to, is played by Patton Oswalt, who plays a character called Doug. And Patton Oswalt is, of course, a bit not the Hollywood standard of attractive. He's a small fat and he's short. And the episode sets this up as supposed to be funny. Like, he's introduced we hear his voice, and then we are shown like a model-y looking guy, and then he moves out of the way, and it's Patton Oswalt. And the music also is like, do, this is funny. And it keeps doing this is funny, which is really annoying because it's not at all funny. It's like, please explain to me, like I am a child, why it is supposed to be funny that she finds this guy irresistibly attractive. I'll wait. Hollywood has a thing about unequal attractiveness that is always treated as either comedy or as a status symbol for the guy. And I am using the term attractiveness here, not as people's actual attractiveness, because, I think Patton Oswalt's cute as hell. And I think there are plenty of other people who do. And, yes, there are people who are concerned about, who have issues about men being shorter or fatter. They're shallow people. And Una has never been shown to be shallow, but Hollywood storytelling always has this idea that there are ranks of attractiveness, and it's always treated as either funny or a status symbol. So you will see a guy who is less of the standard of attractiveness with model beautiful women if he is rich or powerful. Or the other way you see them is in things when the writer when the schlubby guy is sort of a self-insert for the writer, or is in fact played by the writer. And also that is often in comic situations. And it's something that we've seen, it's sort of honeymooners coded as to be in comedy, to have the schlubby looking guy and the model woman. For the woman to be like, really super attracted to the guy, there has to be something weird. And it is so exaggerated that it is clearly intended to be comic. And it's like, Una is not shallow. I really can't see her caring about the height of a guy or the weight of a guy. If they have a connection, they have a connection. Again, Patton Oswalt is cute as fuck. Why not? And also, like, in the real world, people are attracted to fat people without it being funny. It's actually not uncommon for, like, fitness bros to sometimes have a thing for larger women. That's me. And a lot of women, like, the lowest priority is the guy's height or weight. It's just like, and the big muscly guys aren't necessarily attractive. I'm clearly a bisexual person attempting to explain heterosexual female attraction. But also definitely bisexual women are less into the stupid standards. because why the fuck? They are dumb. A connection is far more important. Somebody being sweet and having chemistry, and there are so many more important things. But writers want a cheap laugh. And like it is clearly set up to be a humorous situation. It is not. It is dumb. It is childish and it is obnoxious. And it does play into the eugenicsy stuff because anti-fat bias, which this is doing anti-fat bias. When you're doing it with comedy, you're still reinforcing stupid biases. And anti-fatness is one of the canaries in a coal mine for eugenics because they're always obsessed with people looking healthy. It's the aesthetics of health, never the actual fact of health. And fat people are not the aesthetic of health or the aesthetic of beauty that suits the kind of people who believe in eugenics, the kind of world that they want to build. The other canaries in the coal mine is disability and gender nonconforming, both of which interrelate with fatness as fellow travelers. So yes, when you're take note when you're seeing anti-fatness on the rise to see if you see any other marks of eugenics. Speaking of eugenics, let's talk about how this episode treats race. Oh God damn it. One might say that mixed race and mixed species are not a one-to-one. And they aren't. But in storytelling, every sentient being is a human. Like it doesn't matter if you're writing them as an alien, metaphorically, allegorically, they are human. It is always allegorically human. And it's really, it's kind of what storytelling is for. Like part of why you write is to like sort of get parts of yourself and ideas out of yourself and put them in a form you can see them because so you can think about them and like understand. It's the whole self-alienation thing. And when it's when you're doing it with like different species and fantasy and stuff, it's like taking parts of our species and culture and then that and like putting them into the allegory of something else so that you can kind of understand and bring that back and learn things. That's what story does. So it like the fact that it's imperfect is kind of partly what makes it work as fiction, because like a perfect mirror doesn't teach you as much as an imperfect one. We do also, but we have to also reckon with the fact that that's not actual representation. I have a term for this. Because I haven't heard anyone else have a term exactly for it that I like. So I call it allegorical pseudo representation. Because it's an allegory for human, and it's not actually representation, but it's sort of representation. It represents aspects of the experience, because it can never represent it perfectly. Actual representation of mixed race, like my actual representation of mixed race from Star Trek, especially for me, is Bashir, who is played by Sadiq Al-Fayed, who is British and Middle Eastern, like me. He's Syrian and English. I'm my dad is Egyptian and my mom is Scottish. So yeah. Growing up as a kid, I was like, "Ooh, he's like me," in a different way than like Spock, who I also used to watch and go, "Oh, that's me," or especially more than anyone else, it was B'Elanna Torres in in Voyager. Just I think I was less emotionally controlled than Spock. But yeah, like it's always these are always representations of humanity, and so when there's a mixedness, that is a representation, an allegory of human mixed raceness, and that's also why that always comes up in monster stories and things too. These are always allegorical representations, and like pseudo representations. Like it's sort of a little bit like the way that a slightly off mirror can sometimes show you more of yourself than a full mirror. But it is also when we're talking about discussions of representation, it is also important to have representation in the same way that a story is always allegorically, all characters are allegorically human. Also, stories are always at the same time grounded in the time that they were made, and also being read in the moment we're in. And that the way that lines up in an ill-fitting, but it's still like that gives us some interesting insights. Like, to return to Bashir, you grounded in the 90s when it was made. Hit that representation of a mixed person is a pro-assimilation representation. Basically, he's a Middle Eastern person in the future, but the only Middle Easternness aspect of his culture left is overbearing parents. Great to know that survives. Just one of people go, yep, that's definitely a thing. It'd be nice if like tea or hummus or like the poetry of Khalil Gibran had made it into the future, and these are all things he could have discussed with Garrick. But no, we've just got overbearing parents. Okay, yep. And at the time, that wasn't something I really picked up on because I was a kid, a teenager, but also like that was the world that we were in. But because I'm looking back on it now, I can see that. And anyway, so yeah, a bit of a tangent, but I told you this was unscripted. So anyway, Spock has always been and always will be a representation of a person from a mixed culture background. And the way that he is written will always tell us about how the world that it's being written in views those relationships. In the 60s, we saw him have to be one of the good ones. His Vulcanness had to be useful, and even then, he had to put up with a lot of shit from his coworkers. It was a lot better than what people in the 60s were actually dealing with. But he still had to be the butt of a bunch of green-blooded, pointy-eared comments that, looking back, kind of McCoy, you really want to go there with your friend? Sort of is the response that we have. And like, I'm not canceling McCoy for that. I love McCoy, but it tells us something about the way that the people of the time viewed mixed relationships. And even so, like, Spock was an improvement over how it was usually presented at the time, because usually, up until that point, representations of mixed people were almost invariably in, I'm going to use a period appropriate term because this is what it's referred to as, but it's not a great term, tragic mulatto stories, which is a bad old world word for people who are part black, part something else, usually part white, who would be played often. Those stories would be a cautionary tale against what's called miscegenation, the mixing of races. Yes, it does have a nice stigmatizing term. Yeah, it would be the would always be played as this being this horrible, tragic thing to be caught between two worlds. And one of the reasons why Spock has endured as a character is because his story is more complicated than that. That's one of the reasons why Star Trek is what it is. Because in a time when that was the only way that mixed people were represented, really, or maybe in a sort of fetishistic way occasionally, um, they dared to show him having complicated feelings and complicated experience, and it really gets explored in the TOS movies, where Spock sort of, the very first one, he's sort of diving into his Vulcanness and trying to eliminate his emotional side completely. But then through the story of that film, he like comes to appreciate his feelings. In Wrath of Khan, which is one of the best movies that Star Trek has ever made. It's not my favorite, but it is one of the best in terms of like story and everything. He uses his Vulcan logic to come to the needs of the many outweighs the needs of the few. He uses his logic to choose to do an act of great love and self-sacrifice. And then then through 3 and 4 we have a reintegration as Spock is literally reintegrated. After having his personality having to ride around in McCoy's head, he's literally reintegrated and then emotionally reintegrates in my favorite The Voyage Home, which manages to do comedy, which has aged mostly very well, and have a heart and have meaning and explore, Spock's relationship with himself. You can actually do comedy to great effect, to tell a story. But you have to tell the story. You don't use the setups, the story, just to have setups for jokes. That isn't a lasting or effective story. And the humor will just age like milk. We have this, Spock is this fascinating, wonderful character who goes through these explorations and really shows us what it is to be human and to live in a complex existence. He's also excellent representation, pseudo representation of autism in certain ways, because he's also a person with a different kind of brain trying to live in the world. And yeah, this is why Spock is so beloved. And then the Abrams movies are a bit more clumsy about trying to do it, but they also do. Beyond does reckon somewhat with his experience of his humanness, and they have a whole thing about with the losing, with Vulcan being lost in that timeline, and yeah, and they do show us a bit more some of his childhood and the whole experience there, and yeah, but the way that Strange New World has treated Spock, we did have in the first season there was the scene with Angel, that a lot of people like. I struggled with it, where they, as a non-binary person, talked to Spock about having a complex identity, and there's a lot of beauty in that discussion. In the maybe you aren't one or the other, or maybe you aren't half and half, but maybe you are something different. There's a lot of beauty in that. The reason I struggled is because I felt very uncomfortable with the visuals of a white person lecturing Spock on his identity. That felt a bit a bit off. Like, not drastically, just a bit like, could we maybe do this? You talk about your experience, and that allows Spock to reflect on it. Maybe not, rather than the direct lecturing, but like that is a minor issue. A like you're trying, and I'm not fully enjoying the execution, but I can see that the effort is there, and the heart is in the right place. But then we start getting into charades, and also the whole like rage to sort of heteroize Spock with having him kiss all the girls and have the whole crew acts like they're in Degrassi Junior High. And I loved Degrassi Junior High. That was my age. But it's fine when it's teenagers. But like Enterprise 90210 is not. Anyway, Strange New Worlds got a whole lot into Spock exploring his human side. Cool. However, once they get into charades, it starts being like this essentializing his humanness and his Vulcanness as being essential and genetic and predisposed. And then that's when we're getting like, we've taken this fabulous, fucking amazing character that has given us a chance to explore these ideas and started a whole like series of characters that have given us ways to explore these ideas, and suddenly it's so incredibly regressive. And so, yay, humans good. And I don't like yay, humans are good stories, especially because in Star Trek, every character is human, and the humans are basically Americans, usually, unless they're English. And when when shows do the yay, humans are special and exceptional, it's getting into the American exceptionalism thing, which, as a non-American, as a Middle Eastern person, I hate. Don't hate Americans. But the whole rah America and the story of America, the sort of like ideal of American that is created in the American exceptionalism sucks. It's not who your country is. That's not what's good about your country. I'm not going to say great, because greatness is not a great idea. Yeah. Goodness is better. Decency. A lot of the Americans I know are good, decent people, and who try hard and are optimistic. It's exactly what the Starfleet embodies. People who try and like who always try and who are optimistic and will, never give up. When Star Trek embodies that, it's doing the good. But when it's like presumed humans are good, humans are really cool, as said in this episode, it's just, I don't like it. The whole like this serum makes them Vulcan, so they therefore embody all aspects of Vulcan cultural philosophy. Suddenly they're logic and understand Vulcan cuisine and can do mind melds. It's saying really terrible things about, race and what is and what a person is. Yeah, and it's doing it all for humor. But what it's smuggling really essentialist racial ideas in with humor, because humor gets your guard down if you find it funny. if you like cringe humor enough to find this funny, it's trying to get you to not, I don't know that it's consciously doing it, but what it's doing is lulling you into security while some really bad ideas get filtered in. Again, I hope this was a matter of them falling ass backwards into eugenics, not deliberately writing eugenics. That happens sometimes. Sometimes writers have a good idea and writing to a good idea and then fall ass backwards into some really regressive bad thinking that has been by not thinking through the stories and the culture that they have existed in. My friend and critic, Lonnie Diane Rich, refers to this as the terroir, which is this, an idea that comes from winemaking, that what is in the soil gets in the grapes, gets in the wine. If you have poison in your soil and you don't clean it up, it gets in your grapes and it will get in the wine, and then into the people who drink it. In the storytelling sense, it's like these unexamined ideas. If you don't examine them when you are writing, and especially when you are editing, because this part of the important purpose of editing is to look at, just to be like, look what you accidentally wrote. How about we clean this up? But if you don't do that, then you're smuggling in some really bad ideas, whether you intended to or not. We talked about this recently on Muppet Sex and Trauma. There's a Farscape episode that attempted to do gender on purpose. And it's a show that accidentally does gender really interestingly. They attempted to do gender on purpose and fell ass backwards into transphobia. And it was written in 2001, so it's really unlikely that it's intentional. And these are, generous, usually quite generous creators. But this episode is just dreadful. And you get this sometimes. I honestly think that Code of Honor was probably a fall ass backwards into racism, because the writer just didn't examine their ideas, and they continue to not examine them. So when they wrote that episode for SG-1, they fell ass backwards into it again. It's like you can imagine a Buster Keaton routine of just continuously falling ass backwards into racism. This is why you have critics like Jesse and to a lesser extent me, who talk about these ideas. They talk about the ideas that are there, and so you can examine them and go, oh shit, better not repeat that. And this, in many ways, this episode is repeating stuff from the Voyager episode Faces, an episode where B'Elanna is split into two, and all her Klingonness is distilled into one half, and all her humanness is distilled into the other. And it's a really interesting idea. And I can't imagine that there's ever been a mixed person who hasn't kind of contemplated what it would be like. What it would be like to be entirely one and not the other, and also what it would be like to maybe split in two and see what the two halves are like. I don't know. I'm not in other people's heads, but it's certainly something that has crossed my mind. But they really essentialize everything and have her temper be in her Klingon half, and because they present this not as something that's her perception of herself divided into two, so that these are the things that she perceives to be a part of this half and perceives to be a part of that half. It just makes it literal that the personality is genetics and race, and it's just oh no. And the idea in that story, the sort of the theme, even if it was kind of meh on execution, the theme is that you need both sides of your personality. That you are who you are because of everything that you are. That's a good theme. What is the theme of 4.5 Vulcans? What is this story saying? So Spock is bullied for being not a whole Vulcan by his friends because apparently Vulcanness makes them assholes. And this is treated as a joke, and they never apologize. And we don't get like a way of Spock seeing that both of his cultures are useful and good to him, or that both are part of him. All we see is Vulcan bad, to the point where the Vulcan that we interact with is like humans good. And is that like the lesson feels like, yeah, sure, some people will insult you for being other. Other people will fetishize your otherness as a little hobby and think it's cool. Which, yeah, is true. It's not good. So when I mean fetishizing here, I'm talking about like objectification kind of thing, like turning a person into an object, which can be done for sexual stuff, but is also done for other reasons. And it is really not cool to be dehumanized like that, even in a like positive way. It is a creepy experience. A lot of mixed race people have experienced something of this sort, often all our lives. The sort of exotification of the other. Because there is exotification of the other is part of Orientalism. Edward Said has entered the chat. There is a thing where the Occident, those who see themselves as the default, as the center of the universe, see some parts of themselves or something to play with in the other. And the way that what's talked about sometimes in anthropology is the idea of exotic, erotic, or monster. Or exotic, erotic, or enemy, the 3 E's. And so the enemy is like, in a lot of monster stories, you will see the sort of othered. The other is frightening. So like the mixing with the other becomes sort of pathologized and icky and scary. Or it becomes kind of exotic and, ooh, isn't that neat? Erotic is kind of self-explanatory. But yeah, this is where Orientalism comes from. In Britain during the Empire, there was whole schools of academics who called themselves Orientalists, who were fascinated by the cultures that Britain was subjugating, and would just kind of take their stuff, including sacred stuff, to have as a little collection, as a toy, including people. This is, like people would be displayed. This takes us back to the anti-fat stuff, because this is how Sarah Bartman was taken from Africa and displayed as the quote-unquote Hottentot Venus, another term used at the time that is icky. The white people who considered themselves so-called experts, these Orientalists, were considered to be more of an authority on the cultures they were talking about than people from those cultures. It's really weird to have, like, that's kind of what Patton Oswalt is doing about humanity. Like, he is kind of othering humanity in an Orientalist kind of fashion. And that's just being shown and not being commentated on. And it's kind of like Spock should feel complimented that he thinks humans are cool. Again, I don't think the people writing this actually intended to write this. They didn't think about what they were writing. And whoever, and the story editors or the producers and stuff didn't question or get them to redraft so that there was some kind of meaning in this story, that, you know, some kind of intentional meaning, moral of this story, because Star Trek is supposed to mean something. Science fiction generally is supposed to have something to say, not and to say about and to the world it is written in. That is the most important aspect of science fiction and fantasy, and it is the thing that Star Trek has been. That is what it is to be Star Trek, is to have something to say. And it doesn't always age well. The something you have to say to the moment doesn't always speak to eternity the way that one would hope. And sometimes it does. But when you don't think about what the meaning is supposed to be, you wind up saying some really weird stuff. And I there's just been no thought this season put into, at least I hope there's been no thought put into what this was supposed to mean, because if there has been thought put into what it's supposed to mean, then they've deliberately given us a very regressive human good, Vulcan bad, genetics is destiny. Like, Spock should be more human. And the whole thing about La'an being genetically predisposed to aggression and yada yada evil because of her augment, stuff like that is just, ugh. And this is the same show that gave us that fabulous story about Una's augmentation and how important Star Trek was, how important Starfleet was as a refuge from that, and that Star Trek and Starfleet and the Federation have wonderful ideas but don't always live up to the ideals. That was amazing. How is that the same show that did this? And the thing is sometimes that happens. Like, yeah, the show that did Measure of a Man is also the show that did Code of Honor. But what makes Strange New Worlds unique as a well, practically unique, I don't know, Picard was also similar to this. But what marks out Strange New Worlds is it started good and is getting shit. It lost its beard. The Next Generation started kind of meh in the first couple years, And then it grew its beard, it's found its footing, and it got really good. DS9 started mediocre, got amazing. uh, Voyager had good moments and bad moments, but it didn't just like fall off a cliff after the first season. And yeah, getting back into the it is just, tell me that they didn't intend to give us a eugenics story. Going back to the whole, a story has meaning for the time that it is written in. The time that this was written 2 years ago, but for intents and purposes, this was published yesterday. So the time that it was published in is what, 9 months into the Trump regime, into the Maha movement. Eugenics, literal eugenics, is on the rise. People are being kidnapped for speaking Spanish. I'm not going to call it detained. It's kidnapping. We are nearly 2 years into watching a genocide. That is being treated as, where we are seeing Arab lives being treated as less than meaningless. White supremacy is not systemic right now. It is everything right now. It's overt, and it's rising, and it's fueling the fascism, and the fascism is fueling it. And this is the moment you're going to come out with a story that's telling us that humans good and genetics is destiny. This is the moment you're going to do that. When RFK is dismantling what little health infrastructure America had, and where like the rest of the world, where our healthcare systems are struggling due to COVID, post-COVID sort of infrastructure problems. which I know, putting that after RFK, like instituting eugenics is not the same, but like Star Trek matters because it says something. It says something to the moment that it's written in. I have never forgotten watching Star Trek 6 for the first time when it came out on video. And Dr. McCoy trying everything to save Chancellor Garkon, his country's enemy. I've never forgotten the way that his voice sounded when he said in the trial, "Good God, man, I tried to save him." It's as the child of doctors that like spoke so much to me, and then put like their work into so much focus for me. And like the idea of you try to save your enemy because he's the life in front of you, or and that same, the line from that one as well, if there's to be a new world, you and I are to have the hardest time living in it. the world was changing around us at the time. The Soviet Union was collapsing, and this was the very first like political thing I was aware of. And like Star Trek was there telling us how to live in it. Star Trek 4 is my favorite, and it stands as one of my favorite films, and it is there telling us that our sitting in the 1980s with the holes in the ozone and the animals being hunted to extinction, and Star Trek was there telling us that we have to save the whales to save ourselves. Isn't it ironic, Captain, that while these humans of this time were killing this animal, they were also killing themselves. It wasn't subtle. But it was there telling us that we have to that we have to save the planet to save ourselves. And we did some of that, and then we forgot. It saddened me that in the Bush years, Enterprise failed to speak to the Islamophobia that was going on and instead just did Bush shit. But Discovery spoke directly to losing your ideals and how important it is for Starfleet to embody them. It literally brought the Federation back and like, talked about healing and trauma and spoke to the world we were in and to the importance of Star Trek. Star Trek in the 60s literally said, there's no place for your bigotry on the bridge. It's not Star Trek if it doesn't say something. And it's not Star Trek if it says something fascist. I don't want to be like the anti-woke, the haters who are always like, that's not my Star Trek. It's not Star Trek. It's not Gene's vision, but it's not my Star Trek if it doesn't say something. And I don't want to watch Star Trek that is saying fashy things. Even if I don't think they're intending to do that, if they're not being careful enough and they're falling ass backwards into eugenics and fascism, could you pay attention? Please. Because it's important. What you say matters. And you're saying stupid bloody shit. And this episode sucked. In a storytelling way, it sucked, and the ideas here were just bad. Again, I think Jesse did a much better dive into the eugenics-y side of it than I did, but hopefully this serves as a bit of a yes and, because the anti-fat stuff sucked, and the experience as a mixed race person of watching this was just like, I don't want to watch more assimilation shit. Assimilation is self-harm. It requires you to cut off pieces of yourself. Said it before, and I'll keep saying it. Assimilation is self-harm. Don't teach people to assimilate. There is safety in assimilation, but a lot of children of immigrants can tell you the damage it does to a person. A lot of us see it firsthand. We've either lived it or we've watched it. Assimilation is not. You need to find a way to integrate yourself, all the parts of yourself, even if it's an ongoing process, and find a way to sort of like find a way to be in community with the people who are similar to you and the people who are different than you. I mean, that's what Star Trek is about. Sometimes the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and some ultimately you put all the ones together and you can get a community. But stories like this don't build community. Hopefully I've said something sensible, and editing me has managed to whip this into something that works. Sarah from the future here, and actually I didn't edit this episode. My friend Ren stepped in so that I could take my nibblings to the museum for the day. In addition to being a really good friend, Ren is a YouTuber under the handle Ren the Barbarian, who makes excellent videos on Star Trek, particularly an episode-by-episode, snarky but loving guide to TOS that you should all check out. Thanks, Ren. Yeah, and I'll get back to working on the script about, like, the actual scripted one about the failure of storytelling. But yeah. Like, if you found something worthy in 4.5 Vulcans, we have different senses of humor, and that's okay. Humans can be different from other humans. But I hope you think a little bit about some of the messages that we're coming across, and if you consciously think about them and sort of try and reckon with them, then, like, that's a good way to not absorb those messages. And that's enough to try and think about these things, and think about what your thoughts are on, like, integration and assimilation, and like, how you're in community with people who are different from you. And maybe if you say something shitty, apologize. As nobody really did to Spock. Yeah. I mean, Chapel did apologize to Spock for her behavior, but that gets bound up into all that badly drawn emotional romance plot shit that isn't very good. Enterprise 90210. Anyway, I think that's enough for me. So, as always, thank you to my Patreon supporters. I really appreciate you. And if anyone wants to join them, the links are in the doobly-doo. Or if you don't have funds, that's fine. Or if you only have a limited funds, then support folks who are struggling elsewhere, particularly in Gaza. And let's all be kind to each other and try to survive 2025. Okay, bye.